Good morning. Before we get started with today's lesson, do you remember the lasting memory verses? Psalms 81:9. Let there be no strange God among you, nor shall you worship any foreign God. James 1:6. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. In Mark 16:15-16a. He said to them, Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. As you listen to today's lesson, think about these questions. Number 1. Who was the king in the name of the country that destroyed Jerusalem and took the Jewish people as prisoners? Number 2. Why were Daniel and his 3 friends unwilling to eat food from the king's table, and what request did he make of the king's officer? Number 3. What did the king's examination of the young prince reveal? Number 4. What strange request did King Nebuchadnezzar make of his wise men, and why did he threaten to kill them? And number 5. Who knew how to interpret the king's dream, and how was he rewarded? Daniel and the king's court. Nebuchadnezzar and his army broke down the walls of Jerusalem. They took all the gold and silver vessels from the temple and carried them back to their own land. Then they burned the city. After the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the Chaldean army started the long journey back to Babylon, taking their prisoners with them. Even King Zedekiah was a captive. With him were most of his people, able-bodied men and women, young people, and even children. The Chaldeans called their prisoners from Judah Jews. When the captives from Judah arrived in Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar commanded his chief officer, From our captives, choose the best young men. Look for those who are strong and healthy, wise, trained, and able. Bring them to the palace and teach them our language. The chief officer obeyed. The king explained that the young men were to eat food from his own table. That would help them to grow strong, he thought. At the end of 3 years, these young men were to be brought to be king. Among those chosen from the captives were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, Daniel and his 3 friends wanted to keep the law God had given to the people of Israel. According to that law, there were some kinds of food they could not eat. When the foods was brought from the king's table, Daniel saw food that Israelites were not allowed to eat.
What should he do? Daniel and his 3 friends decided they must do what seemed right. Bravely, Daniel told the officer, It would be wrong for us to eat the king's meat and drink his wine. Do not force us to do this. At first, the officer was afraid the king would be displeased if the boys refused to eat his food. He said, When you stand before the king, he will be very angry with me if you do not look as strong and healthy as the other young fellows. The king might even kill me for not taking good care of you. Try us for 10 days, Daniel bargained. Let us eat good vegetables and drink pure water. Then see if we do not look as strong and as healthy as the other young men. Daniel's offer seemed fair enough, so the officer agreed. For 10 days, he brought them vegetables and wholesome food instead of rich food and wine from the king's table. At the end of 10 days, the officer noticed that Daniel and his 3 friends looked even healthier than the others. From that time on, Daniel and his friends were given the wholesome food they wanted.
And God blessed Daniel and his friends with wisdom. In a short time, they learned the language and wisdom of the Chaldeans. 3 years passed. Then the king ordered, Bring the young men to me. When they came, he talked with them and asked hard questions. He discovered that Daniel and his 3 friends were 10 times wiser than the wisest men of the kingdom. No wonder Nebuchadnezzar was pleased with these young Jews. He gave them places of honor in the kingdom, and they lived in Babylon for many years. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar had a very strange dream. When he awoke, he was so troubled that he could not go back to sleep. The dream was so unusual, he decided it must have a deep meaning. In the morning, I'll call the wise men and have them explain the dream, he decided. Morning came at last, but when Nebuchadnezzar got up, he could not remember his dream. Now he was even more troubled than before. The dream was too important to forget. At once, he sent for his wise men. When they came, he said, I have had a very strange dream, and I am anxious to know what it means. O king, live forever, the wise man said. Tell us your dream, and we will tell you what it means. But I have forgotten the dream, the king answered. If you do not tell me what I dreamed and what it means, you shall all be killed. If you tell me my dream and explain its meaning, I will give you rich gifts and great honor.
How puzzled the wise men were. Surely the king was being unfair. How could any person know what someone else had dreamed and forgotten? A second time the wise men said, But you must tell us the dream before we can explain it to you. Nebuchadnezzar became very angry. After accusing them of putting off answering in order to gain time, he decreed that all the wise men of Babylon should be killed. At once he sent Arioch, the captain of the guard, to get all the wise men. Daniel and his 3 friends had heard nothing of the king's decree until Arioch came to take them. When Daniel heard what had happened, he asked to see the king. At the palace, he told Nebuchadnezzar, If you will give me a little time, I will find out what the dream was and explain its meaning. The king agreed. At once, Daniel hurried back to his 3 friends and told them about his agreement, even though no man was wise enough to tell the king's dream. God knew about it. Earnestly, the 4 prayed for God's help. That night, God showed Daniel the king's dream and its meaning.
How thankful Daniel was. He prayed, Blessed be the name of God, forever and ever. Wisdom and might are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and set them up. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness and what is in the light. I thank you and praise you. O God of my fathers, you have given me wisdom and might. You have answered our prayer, for you have made me know about the king's dream. Quickly, Daniel went to Arioch, the captain of the guard, and said, Do not kill the wise man, but take him to the king. I can tell him his dream. Arioch, too, was glad. As he brought Daniel before the king, he said, I have found a man among the captives of Judah who will tell you about your dream. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, The secret you want to know is one that no man could tell you, but there is a God in heaven who knows all secrets. He has told me about your dream. The king listened closely, and Daniel said, O king, when you went to bed, you wondered what could happen in the future. Then you fell asleep, and God showed you what would happen. You saw a great bright image of a man. The head was made of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the waist and hips of brass, the legs of iron, and the feet were part clay and part iron. You saw a stone, not moved by hands, roll against the feet of this great image. The stone broke the feet, and the whole image fell into the ground and broke into pieces. The pieces were fine as dust, and the wind blew them away. While you watched, the stone grew bigger until it became a mountain and filled the whole earth. The king nodded. Now he remembered his dream. Daniel had told it exactly right.
Now I will tell you what this dream means. Daniel said, God wants to teach you through this dream. The great image represents the 4 great kingdoms of the earth. Your kingdom is first, the head of gold. After you will come a lesser king, represented by the chest and arms of silver. The 3rd kingdom is shown by parts of brass, and the 4th by the iron legs and feet. At first, this 4th kingdom will be very strong, but it will become weaker, as shown by the iron and the clay feet. In the days of these kings, said Daniel, God will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. His kingdom is represented by the stone, not moved with hands, that rolled against the image. God will increase his kingdom until it fills the whole earth, and every other kingdom will be broken into pieces. This, O king, is the meaning of your dream. The king was amazed how wise Daniel was. Perhaps the king thought Daniel was a god, for he bowed down on the floor to worship him. Daniel reminded the king that it was the God of heaven who had told Daniel the dream and its meaning. Nebuchadnezzar said, Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets. To Daniel the king gave many great gifts, and made him ruler of all the province of Babylon. From that time on, Daniel was the head of all the wise men in the kingdom. Because Daniel had told the king's dream, none of the wise men were killed. At Daniel's request, his 3 friends were made governors of the land. These young men were given Chaldean names. The king knew them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Now let's answer the questions from earlier. Number 1. Who was the king and the name of the country that destroyed Jerusalem and took the Jewish people as prisoners? It was King Nebuchadnezzar, and the country was Babylon. Number 2. Why were Daniel and his 3 friends unwilling to eat food from the king's table? And what request did he make of the king's officer? They wanted to keep the laws of God and asked to be fed only vegetables, water, and bread for 10 days. Number 3. What did the king's examination of the young prince reveal? They looked healthier and were the wisest men in all the kingdom. Number 4. What strange request did King Nebuchadnezzar make of his wise men, and why did he threaten to kill them? He threatens to kill them because they could not fulfill his request to tell him about his dream and what it meant. And number 5. Who knew how to interpret the king's dream, and how was he rewarded? Daniel interpreted the king's dream, and King Nebuchadnezzar rewarded him by making Daniel the ruler of all the province of Babylon. This week's memory verse is Matthew 15:11. It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man. Think about it. Unbaptized arms.
Ivan the Terrible was one of the great czars of 16th century Russia, best known for his erratic behavior and his brutality. He was so busy conquering new territories for his country that he had no time to find a wife. His advisors became concerned that he had not married and therefore would not produce an heir to the throne. So Ivan commanded his men to find him a suitable wife who was beautiful, intelligent, and the daughter of a nobleman. They found her in Greece. Her name was Sophia, the daughter of the king of Greece. Ivan asked the king for his daughter's hand in marriage, and the king agreed on the condition that Ivan be baptized and join the church. Ivan agreed and set out for Greece to be married, accompanied by 500 of his best soldiers.
When they discovered that Ivan was to be baptized, the soldiers said they wanted to be baptized also. A requirement of baptism was to make a profession of faith and to affirm the articles of the Orthodox Church, which the soldiers agreed to do, except for one. The article they couldn't affirm was one which prohibited them from being professional soldiers. They asked the priest if they could have some time to think over the problem of how to join the church and at the same time remain soldiers in Ivan's army. They devised a plan among themselves and announced that they were ready to be baptized. They marched out into the water, all 500 of them, with 500 priests. As the priests put the soldiers under the water, each soldier grasped his sword and lifted it high in the air. The soldiers were baptized completely, except for their swords and their fighting arms. Those who witnessed the mass baptism said that it was an amazing spectacle to see 500 dry arms and 500 swords sticking up out of the water. Application.
The soldiers had decided they could give all of themselves to the church except for their fighting arms and their swords. These will remain in possession of the state. Some of us today are no different from those soldiers. We want to become Christians and to possess the promise of eternal life. We want the blessings of God on our lives and to be part of His forever family, the church. But we want it on our terms. So we come to Christ with one arm up out of the water. In our hands we hold those things we are unwilling to let go of: our possessions, our time, our money, our friends, our bad habits. But Paul writes in Romans 12, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your body as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. We must offer to God our whole selves, not just part of us. What part of your life have you been unwilling to give to God? What is the unbaptized arm in your life? Our memory verse is, "It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man." Matthew 15:11.
This concludes today's lesson.